Ethan had always known his life on the farm was simple, quiet. The winds that howled over the barren land were a constant reminder of the isolation he embraced. It was just him and his routine. Check the crops, tend to the animals, and repair the broken fences. Nothing exciting, nothing extraordinary. That is, until the night the storm hit. He had been sitting on his porch, the thick clouds rolling in, when he heard the sound. It wasn't the usual rumbling of thunder, but a distant hum, like something alien. For a moment, he thought it was just the wind, but then the ground vibrated under his boots. His comm device sputtered with static, but he dismissed it. The storm always played tricks with the comms. As he stared into the night, a figure appeared through the mist. She stumbled into his yard, barely able to keep her feet. Her skin wasn't like anything he had ever seen before, violet with a faint glow. Her eyes, silver and wide, seemed to capture the moonlight, reflecting a terror he couldn't ignore. She fell to her knees, gasping for breath. Ethan rushed over, his heart pounding in his chest. "Are you all right?" he asked, kneeling beside her. Her body was cold, drenched from the rain, but she managed to look up at him, her lips trembling. "Please," she whispered, "help me." Ethan hesitated, trying to make sense of the situation. Her words were clear, but the desperation in her voice made him feel like he was in a nightmare. She wasn't human, but she didn't seem like a threat either. The faint hum of her body, the soft glow of her skin, it was all too strange, too out of place. He reached out, supporting her. "Who are you?" "I am Princess Aelira," she said, her voice weak but commanding. "And I need refuge. They are coming for me." Ethan helped her to her feet, his instincts telling him to get her inside, away from whatever was coming. He didn't know who they were, but the way her voice cracked when she said it made him think it wasn't good. "Where are you from?" he asked, guiding her into the barn. The storm raged outside, but it was safe here. Well, safer than out there. She collapsed onto the hay bales in the corner, her body shaking. Ethan hurried to grab a blanket. "I'm from the Zarin Empire," she managed, "but I'm being hunted by the Zenthar Dominion. They want what I carry." Ethan stared at her, still confused. "The Zenthar Dominion. They're a ruthless, bloodthirsty faction," she said, her voice growing fainter. "They'll stop at nothing to take the artifact I carry." Artifact. Ethan didn't understand, but the fear in her eyes was enough to make him believe her. Aelira closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, her gaze was sharper, more focused. She reached into the folds of her clothing and pulled out a small glowing crystal. It hummed with an otherworldly energy, lighting up the dim barn with a soft blue glow. Ethan took a step back. The crystal wasn't like anything he had ever seen. It seemed to pulse, alive, as if it had a mind of its own. "I offer this to you," she said, her voice trembling. "If you protect me, I will teach you how to use it. It has the power to control technologies beyond your comprehension. Things you can't even imagine." Ethan stared at the crystal in disbelief. Could it be true? A piece of alien technology, a relic from an empire far beyond Earth's reach. He wasn't equipped for this. He was just a farm boy. But as he looked back at Aelira, who was now resting on the hay, her eyes closed, the weight of her words hung in the air. "How is this going to help us?" Ethan asked, looking at the crystal again. Aelira opened her eyes, her face filled with both fear and determination. "It's the only way. If the Zenthar find me, they will use this crystal to wage war across the galaxy. And they will come to Earth next." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Earth. He had never thought about anything beyond his little farm. He never thought the fate of an entire world could rest on his shoulders. But now, with this alien princess before him, with the power of a crystal that could change everything, he realized how wrong he had been to think his life was simple. "I'm just a farmer," Ethan said quietly, sitting down next to her. "What can I do to stop them?" "You can do more than you think," Aelira said, her voice still weak but filled with hope. "You have courage, And that is what we need. As Ethan listened to her story, he realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about hiding her. This was a battle for survival, a fight to protect Earth itself from an enemy far more powerful than anything he could have ever imagined. And it had all started with a stranger, an alien princess, showing up at his doorstep. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but Ethan wasn't worried about the weather anymore. He was worried about what was coming next. Suddenly, a bright light pierced the darkness outside. Ethan froze, his heart racing. He rushed to the crack in the barn's wall, peering out into the night. There were shapes in the sky, moving fast. Alien ships. "They're here," Alara whispered. "They found us." Ethan's mind raced. How long did they have? Minutes? Seconds? He didn't know. The barn was small, and the walls wouldn't protect them for long if the Xanthar ships scanned the area. The enemy was known for their technology, their advanced weapons, and their ruthless tactics. "Get up," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. "We need to move. Now." Alara nodded weakly, her hands trembling as she clutched the crystal to her chest. "You have to hide the signal. Use the crystal. It can cloak us." "Cloak us?" Ethan repeated, confused. "The crystal," she explained quickly. "It can hide us from their scans. It can create an invisible field. But you need to focus. Focus on protecting us." Ethan looked at her, his mind racing. Could he really do this? Could he protect her and use the crystal to escape the Xanthar? He didn't have a choice. With the storm pounding outside, he placed the crystal in his hands and concentrated. He felt a surge of energy, like the crystal was alive in his palms. A soft hum filled the barn, and then, nothing. Ethan's heart sank. Had he done it wrong? Had they already been found? But then, the world outside the barn seemed to blur. The air shimmered, and the sound of the storm seemed to fade away. The cloaking field was working. They were hidden. For the first time since Alara had appeared on his doorstep, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't sure how long it would last, but for now, they were safe. "We need to move quickly," Alara whispered, her voice now filled with urgency. "They won't stop until they have me, until they have the crystal. And once they do, Earth will be in grave danger." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. He had no idea what lay ahead, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let them win. Not now. Not when the fate of the world rested in his hands. They had to fight, and he was going to do whatever it took to protect Alara. The storm outside raged on, but inside the barn, for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt a glimmer of something else. Determination. The battle had only just begun. The following morning, Ethan woke to a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving the morning sky clear, but the air felt heavy, as if something was wrong. He had barely managed to get any sleep after what happened last night. The farm was eerily silent, save for the usual sounds of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional crowing of the rooster. But there was a tension in the air, something he couldn't explain. Alara had stayed close to him, sleeping fitfully on the hay in the barn. Despite her exhaustion, the alien princess seemed to have regained some strength after the previous night. But she wasn't fully recovered. Ethan had watched her closely, knowing that every second counted. The Xanthar, whoever they were still out there, hunting her, hunting them. Ethan had spent the early hours of the morning going over the land surrounding the barn, trying to get a sense of where the enemy might be. He knew the terrain like the back of his hand, having spent years working the farm, navigating its fields, hills, and hidden paths. But nothing could have prepared him for the high-tech, stealthy forces of the Xanthar. The more he thought about them, the more dangerous they seemed. Suddenly, the stillness of the morning was broken by a low hum in the distance. Ethan's heart stopped for a moment. He knew that sound. It was the unmistakable hum of a cloaked drone, one of the Xanthar's high-tech reconnaissance devices. The thought made his blood run cold. They were getting closer. Ethan's mind raced. He needed to act fast. The barn wouldn't provide protection forever. He had to move Elira, and he had to do it without being seen. He rushed back to the barn, but before he could say anything, Elira opened her eyes. She was awake, alert. She must have sensed the same danger. "Are they here?" she whispered, her silver eyes wide with fear. "They're close," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need you to help me." Elira slowly sat up, her body trembling. She was still weak, but there was a determination in her gaze. "I can help," she said, "but you must trust me." Ethan nodded, unsure of what she had in mind, but desperate for anything that would work. Without another word, Elira reached for the glowing crystal around her neck. She held it in her hands, her fingers brushing its smooth surface. The crystal hummed with power as she concentrated. Ethan stood by, waiting, watching her every move. The air in the barn seemed to grow heavy with energy. The crystal in Elira's hands began to glow brighter, casting strange shadows on the walls. The hum of its energy filled the space, growing louder by the second. "Focus on the crystal," Elira instructed. "Visualize the field. Focus on hiding us from their sensors." Ethan didn't know how he knew, but he felt the urge to do exactly as she said. He reached out and took the crystal in his hands, feeling the strange, alien warmth pulse through his fingertips. For a moment, he almost felt connected to it, like it wasn't just an object, but a living thing with a mind of its own. He closed his eyes, willing his focus to narrow on the sensation of the energy flowing from the crystal. He thought of the barn, of the land around them, of the need to protect Elira from the searchers outside. His mind was racing, but somehow, he felt something. Something was happening. Elira let out a strained breath, her face contorting with the effort of wielding the crystal's power. Ethan's hands tightened around it, and suddenly, the world around them seemed to flicker. A gentle wave of energy rippled through the air, like the shimmer of heat rising from the ground on a hot day. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. For a moment, everything was still. Ethan opened his eyes and stared around the barn, unsure of what had just happened. But then it hit him. The sound of the drone had stopped. The tension in the air had vanished. The enemy was still out there, but for now, they were invisible. "We're cloaked," Elira said, her voice soft but relieved. "We're hidden from their sensors for a short time, but it won't last long." Ethan let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. It worked. They were safe, for now. But even as he felt a sense of relief, the reality of their situation set in. He knew the Zenthar wouldn't stop searching. They had already seen Elira's crystal, and the bounty on her head was only growing. "We need to move," Ethan said, his voice steady. "The cloaking field won't last. I'll move you to the safe house." Elira nodded, but before she could respond, she slumped, clearly exhausted from using the crystal's power. Ethan rushed to her side, catching her before she could fall. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to drain myself so much. The crystal's power is overwhelming." "You did great," Ethan reassured her. He gently helped her to her feet. "But we need to keep moving. We can't let them find us." Together, they crept through the barn and out the back door, moving as quietly as they could. The farm was vast, but there were hidden paths Ethan knew well, places where the land would conceal them for a time. He had to rely on his knowledge of the terrain, using every trick he'd learned over the years to stay one step ahead of the Zenthar's reconnaissance drones. But as they moved, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The air seemed charged, as though something unseen was watching them, waiting. He glanced over at Elira, who was still struggling to keep up, her breath shallow, her face pale from the effort. "We can't stop," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to get to the river." The river was a good distance away, but it was their only real chance of escape. If they could reach the old bridge, they'd be able to cross into the hills. where the Zentvar couldn't follow them as easily. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than staying in the open. As they made their way toward the river, the sound of the drones grew louder. Ethan's heart raced. The Zentvar were closing in. Then, without warning, a group of Zentvar bounty hunters appeared at the far side of the field, their cloaked figures moving swiftly through the tall grass. Ethan's stomach dropped. They had found them. He turned to Alira, who was barely holding herself up. "Can you cloak us again?" he asked. I don't know," she said, her voice shaky. "The crystal. It's too much for me right now." Ethan looked around, trying to think of another plan. They couldn't outrun the Zentvar, but they could fight. "Get behind me," he ordered, his voice firm. "I won't let them take you." Alira looked at him, her eyes wide with fear, but she nodded. She had no choice. As the Zentvar bounty hunters drew closer, Ethan prepared himself. He didn't know what kind of weapons they carried, but he was ready for anything. The fight was coming, and there was no turning back now. Ethan's resolve hardened. He wasn't going to let them take her, not without a fight. The tension in the air was suffocating as Ethan and Alira made their way through the dense underbrush. Every step was careful, measured, as if the very earth beneath their feet was betraying them. The Zentvar were getting closer. Ethan could feel it in his bones. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his mind raced through every escape route he could think of. But as the sounds of the cloaked drones became louder, it was clear that they were closing in on their position. They had no more time to waste. Ethan crouched low, signaling Alira to do the same. Her breathing was shallow, and her face was pale from exertion, but she nodded silently. She was struggling to keep up, the strain of using the crystal taking its toll on her. But there was a fire in her eyes. She wasn't giving up. Not now, not when they were so close to freedom. "Get ready," Ethan whispered, pulling his pack tighter and checking his surroundings. He had learned long ago how to fight, how to survive. But this was different. These weren't just any attackers. These were aliens, ruthless, technologically advanced, and well-prepared. Alira's voice was a mere breath as she spoke. "We need to hold them off long enough to reach the river. If we can make it to the bridge." "I know," Ethan cut her off, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. He wasn't sure they could make it that far, but he wasn't about to let her down. Not after everything they had been through. They both froze as a loud thud echoed through the trees. Ethan's instincts kicked in. They weren't alone. The Zentvar had found them. A group of towering Zentvar warriors emerged from the shadows, their massive armored bodies moving with unsettling grace. Each of them carried plasma weapons that hummed with deadly energy. They were everything Ethan had feared, tall, strong, and relentless. The air seemed to crackle with their power, and the way they moved as a unit suggested they had fought together for years. Alira's eyes widened as the Zentvar warriors advanced, their sharp gazes scanning the area. She was preparing to fight, but Ethan could see the hesitation in her eyes. She was still too weak to rely solely on the crystal's power, but they didn't have a choice. They had to act now. Ethan's mind raced, quickly calculating their options. The warriors were closing in, and they had no cover. They couldn't outrun them, but maybe, just maybe, he could outsmart them. He grabbed Alira's hand and pulled her to the side, motioning for her to stay low. Then he quickly scanned the area, spotting a series of rocks and a small outcrop ahead. It was a narrow gap between the trees, but it could work. It wasn't much, but it was something. "We'll use the terrain," Ethan muttered. "Stay close. I'll set traps." Alira nodded silently, trusting him without question. She was strong, but she wasn't foolish. She knew they couldn't fight the Zentvar head-on, not without more time, more strength. And time was something they didn't have. Ethan worked quickly, his hands moving as he set up crude but effective traps. He used the environment to his advantage. Rocks, ropes, anything he could find. His heart raced, and sweat beaded on his forehead as he worked. But his training, his instincts, kept him steady. The Zenthar were getting closer. He could hear their footsteps now, the sound of their armor scraping against the ground. He needed to hurry. Aelira watched him carefully, her silver eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. She was poised, waiting for the right moment to strike. Her alien grace was evident even in this tense moment. Ethan had no doubt she was capable of great things, but not like this. Not yet. Finally, Ethan finished setting up the traps. He motioned for Aelira to move into position, her graceful movements betraying her alien agility. She was ready. As the Zenthar warriors emerged from the trees, Ethan took a deep breath and gave the signal. He yanked on a rope, and a large boulder rolled down the hill, smashing into one of the warriors. The impact sent the Zenthar soldier flying, its armor cracking under the force. Aelira wasted no time. She lunged at the other warrior, her body moving with fluid precision. She struck hard, her swift blows finding their mark. Ethan couldn't help but marvel at how easily she moved. Every motion was calculated, graceful, and devastating. But despite their best efforts, they couldn't hold their ground for long. The Zenthar were relentless, their superior numbers and advanced technology overwhelming them. Ethan ducked behind a boulder, narrowly avoiding a plasma blast that left a sizzling mark on the stone. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he couldn't afford to panic. Aelira was beside him, her breath heavy, her hands trembling slightly from the exertion. I can't hold them off for much longer," she gasped, her voice tight with strain. Ethan knew they were running out of time. He glanced over at the Zenthar warriors as they closed in, their plasma weapons crackling with energy. They needed to escape, and fast. Aelira reached for the crystal hanging from her neck, her fingers brushing its smooth surface. I can try again," she said, her voice uncertain. "No," Ethan said firmly. "You've already used too much energy. If we don't move now, we're finished." They had one last option, one last chance. Ethan gritted his teeth, his resolve hardening. He had to make a decision. He couldn't let Aelira go down without a fight. Not now. "Stay low," he ordered. "I'll buy us some time." Before Aelira could protest, Ethan charged forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He dove into the midst of the Zenthar warriors, drawing their attention away from Aelira. Plasma blasts whizzed past him, narrowly missing him as he darted around, trying to stay one step ahead. The Zenthar were fast, too fast, but Ethan had the advantage of unpredictability. He moved like a shadow, dodging their attacks and taking advantage of their momentary lapses in coordination. He fought with everything he had, every ounce of his energy, knowing it was their only hope. Aelira, though weakened, followed his lead. She was still dangerous, even in her weakened state. She attacked with precision, using the environment to her advantage, taking out a few more of the Zenthar soldiers. But even together, they were fighting a losing battle. Then, just as Ethan felt the last of his strength waning, the crystal in Aelira's hands pulsed with energy. For a moment, it seemed like time itself stopped. The air around them crackled with raw power. Aelira's eyes glowed with intensity as she released a burst of energy from the crystal. A shockwave erupted, knocking back the Zenthar warriors and disabling their advanced weapons. The plasma rifles fizzled and sparked as they fell to the ground, their power systems fried by the crystal's pulse. The shockwave was their chance. With the Zenthar temporarily disabled, Ethan grabbed Aelira's hand and pulled her toward the nearby woods. They didn't look back as they ran, the sound of the Zenthar regaining their bearings echoing behind them. But this time, they had a head start. They were alive. For now. But Ethan knew one thing for sure. They couldn't keep running forever. Ethan and Aelira stood at the edge of the small clearing, the weight of the situation pressing down on them like a storm cloud. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, and the world around them seemed unnervingly quiet, too quiet. The sound of distant footsteps, the faint hum of Zenthar drones, were growing closer with each passing second. The moment they had feared was finally upon them, the final stand. Ethan's grip tightened around the crystal, the cool surface of it familiar in his hand, but the true weight of what it meant was just beginning to settle in. Alyra, her face as pale as it had been since they first met, was standing beside him, her eyes hard with determination. But there was something more in her gaze now, something she hadn't shared with him until now. "Alyra," Ethan said, his voice low but steady, "what aren't you telling me?" Her eyes flickered to the ground, and for a long moment it seemed as though she might keep the secret to herself. But then she sighed and looked up at him. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the gravity of her next words. "The crystal," she began softly, her voice barely a whisper over the distant noise of the approaching Zenthar. "It's not just a weapon. It's the key to something much worse." Ethan frowned, his brow furrowing as he stepped closer to her. "What do you mean?" "I thought it was just a way to protect us." Alyra's eyes were filled with a mixture of regret and sorrow. "The Zenthar, they're not just hunting me. They want the crystal because it's the key to a superweapon, one that can wipe out entire planets." She paused, her voice trembling slightly as the full weight of what she was saying sank in. "If they unlock its power, Earth, it'll be destroyed. They'll use it to crush every resistance across the galaxy." Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the shock hit him. A superweapon capable of wiping out entire planets. His mind raced, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what she was saying. But the reality of it was impossible to ignore. They were fighting for more than just survival. They were fighting for the future of the Earth itself. He glanced at Alyra, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes. She had carried this burden alone for so long, but now it was his fight too. "I won't let them take it," Ethan said, his voice hard with resolve. "We have to stop them, no matter the cost." Alyra nodded, the weight of his words giving her strength. "We don't have much time," she warned. "Once the Zenthar figure out how to use the crystal, there will be no stopping them. We need to destroy it, or they'll use it to destroy everything we'd fought for." Ethan knew she was right, but as the Zenthar drones drew nearer, he realized there was more at play here than just stopping them from getting the crystal. It wasn't just about fighting off a few alien soldiers anymore. It was about saving the entire planet, the entire human race. With a deep breath, Ethan turned away from Alyra and began setting up what little defenses he could. He had no illusions about the situation. There was no way they were going to win this fight without reinforcements. He had sent a desperate signal to the human resistance group, hoping that someone, anyone, would hear it in time. But there was no telling if help would come, or if it would come too late. He glanced over at Alyra as she stood, her fingers tracing the crystal. She looked ready for whatever came next, but Ethan could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She had already given so much, physically and emotionally. He wasn't sure how much longer she could keep fighting, but there was no turning back now. "Do you think they'll get the signal?" Alyra asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of distant plasma blasts. Ethan nodded grimly. "They have to. There's no one else to help us." They were alone, completely alone. As the Zenthar drones neared, their eerie hum growing louder, Ethan steeled himself for the inevitable. He set traps around the perimeter, using the environment to his advantage. Rocks, trees, anything he could find, he turned into a weapon. But deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. The Zenthar were coming in force. The drones were just the beginning. Moments later, the sound of a plasma blast cut through the air, followed by the unmistakable hum of Zenthar soldiers advancing. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest, and adrenaline coursed through his veins. He looked to Alyra, who was readying herself for battle. She wasn't the same frightened girl he had first found. She had become a warrior in her own right, and her determination matched his own. "They're here," Ethan said quietly. The first wave of drones emerged, their cloaking devices flickering for just a moment before their outlines became visible. They hovered above the ground, their mechanical eyes scanning for movement. Ethan held his breath, waiting for the right moment. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he activated the traps. Rocks flew from hidden positions, knocking out a few of the drones, but there were too many. Too many to stop with simple tricks. Elira held her ground, her focus unshaken as she pulled the crystal from around her neck. It began to hum with power, its energy swirling around her. She wasn't just holding it. She was becoming one with it. But even with its power, there was no denying the overwhelming force that was coming their way. Just as the drones opened fire, a bright flash lit up the sky. Ethan's heart leaped as he heard the unmistakable sound of human fighters. Reinforcements. The human resistance had arrived, but as Ethan looked up, he saw the gravity of their situation. The Zenthar army was vast, and their advanced technology made them formidable opponents. The resistance fighters were brave, but they were also outgunned and outnumbered. Their chances of success were slim, and the fight was about to get a whole lot worse. The battle erupted in a blur of chaos. Plasma fire filled the air, scorching the ground around them. Ethan ducked and rolled, avoiding a blast that singed the edge of his shirt. He drew his sidearm, firing in quick, practiced bursts, hitting a few of the advancing drones. But they kept coming, relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Elira fought beside him, her movements a deadly dance as she used the crystal's power to shield herself from the oncoming fire. The Zenthar soldiers were adapting quickly, countering their every move. And just when it seemed like they might have the upper hand, another wave of Zenthar reinforcements poured in from behind. The resistance fighters were holding their ground, but Ethan could see the fear in their eyes. The Zenthar were everywhere, and they weren't going down without a fight. There was no way they could win this battle unless they could somehow turn the tide. And fast. Ethan's mind raced, but there was no time for hesitation. They had to hold their position. He couldn't let the Zenthar get any closer to the crystal. If they did, it would all be over. The galaxy would be lost. With a final, desperate yell, Ethan charged forward, leading the resistance fighters in a last-ditch effort to hold the line. Plasma fire crackled in every direction, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The future of Earth, the future of humanity, depended on them. But even with reinforcements, the odds seemed impossible. They were losing ground, and the Zenthar were closing in. Ethan knew this could be the end, but he would fight to the last breath. The battle raged on with an intensity that left no room for breath. Explosions cracked the air, and the earth beneath them trembled with each blast. Ethan's mind was focused on only one thing: survival. Every instinct he had screamed at him to keep moving, to keep fighting, but it wasn't just for himself anymore. He had to protect Elira. She was his responsibility now. He could hear the constant hum of the Zenthar drones, the crackling of plasma fire, and the shouts of resistance fighters. But everything seemed muffled. His eyes remained on Elira, who was fighting with grace and precision. Her agility was something Ethan had never seen before, and in the chaos, she was a force of nature. But even she was starting to tire. He could see it in her face, the way her movements slowed ever so slightly, the way she staggered after every fight. They were losing ground. Ethan's hand trembled as he gripped his weapon tighter. He had no illusions about what was coming. The Zenthar forces were overwhelming. Their numbers were too great, and their technology too advanced. And then, just when he thought things couldn't get worse, a Zenthar warrior appeared out of the chaos, charging straight toward Elira. She didn't see him coming. Time seemed to slow as Ethan's heart raced. Without thinking, he threw himself in front of her. The blast from the Zenthar warrior's plasma rifle caught him in the side, searing through his flesh with a force that dropped him to the ground. Pain exploded through him, but he didn't scream. He couldn't afford to. His vision blurred as he saw Elira's face, twisted in horror. "No," she screamed. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she tried to stop the blood from pouring out of his side. He could feel the warmth of it, his life slipping away with every second. But all he could focus on was her. "Ethan, no, you can't. Elira's voice cracked with desperation. He forced a weak smile, blood coating his lips. "I'll be fine," he whispered, even though he knew it was a lie. "You need to stay alive. They can't win. You have to fight." Elira shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She was trembling, her hands still pressed against his wound, but it was clear she couldn't stop the bleeding. And she knew it. Ethan could see the panic in her eyes, the horror, the fear of losing him. She wasn't the only one scared. He could feel the darkness closing in on him. The pain in his side was unbearable, and his vision was growing dim. But through the haze, he heard the sound of the Zenthar advancing again, their relentless march continuing despite the losses they had already taken. It was clear that the battle wasn't over. If Elira didn't do something, if she didn't do something drastic, they would both die here. Elira's hand trembled as she reached for the crystal that hung around her neck. The energy pulsed within it, a faint blue glow radiating from its surface. Ethan's bloodshot eyes tracked her every movement. "Elira," he murmured weakly. "I can't lose you, Ethan," she whispered, her voice broken, her fingers curling tightly around the crystal. And then, as if a decision had been made, Elira pressed the crystal into her palm. The energy within it surged, and a deafening hum filled the air. The very earth beneath them seemed to vibrate, the power flowing from the crystal like a torrent. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine as the energy began to crackle around them. Elira's eyes turned to steel, and a fierce determination crossed her face. "What are you doing?" Ethan gasped, struggling to stay conscious. "I'm not letting you die," she said, her voice low and filled with resolve. Before Ethan could say anything more, Elira closed her eyes and tapped into the crystal's forbidden power. The air around them shifted, and the earth shook violently. A shockwave of energy rippled outward, crackling with raw force, and the Zenthar soldiers nearby were blown off their feet. The very sky seemed to tear apart with the power of the crystal. Ethan gasped, his body struggling to stay conscious as the energy consumed the battlefield. The Zenthar forces faltered, their weapons short-circuiting as the shockwave disabled their advanced technology. Drones plummeted from the sky, their systems fried beyond repair. The remaining Zenthar soldiers, disoriented and confused, fell back, unsure of what had just happened. Elira's eyes were wide, her body trembling as the crystal's energy surged through her. She was barely able to stand, her body racked with pain. The forbidden energy was too much for her to bear, and she fell to her knees, gasping for air. Her vision blurred as she collapsed beside Ethan, the crystal slipping from her fingers. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He reached out, gathering what little strength he had left, and pulled her into his arms. Her body was cold, her skin pale, and he could feel the weight of her life slipping away. He pressed his hand against her chest, desperate to keep her alive, but he could feel the life force within her flickering like a dying flame. "Elira, please," Ethan whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "Don't leave me. Not like this." He knew the situation was dire. The Zenthar had retreated for now. But the cost of their victory had been too high. The battlefield was littered with the fallen, both human and Zenthar, and the air smelled of smoke and destruction. But none of that mattered to Ethan. Elira was fading, and there was only one way to save her. Ethan's hand hovered over the crystal. It had given them victory, but it was also the source of her collapse. He wasn't sure what he could do with it, but if there was any chance of saving her, he had to try. He grabbed the crystal and pressed it to her chest, hoping the last remnants of its power would somehow be enough to heal her. The crystal's energy hummed faintly, as though it too had been drained by the forbidden force Elira had unleashed. The crackling energy seemed to swirl around them, but it wasn't enough. He needed more. Ethan's heart raced as the last of his strength drained away. He could feel his vision going black, the pain in his side becoming unbearable. But he refused to give up. Not now. Not when he had come so far. "I won't lose you, Elira," he said, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. And then, as if responding to his words, the crystal pulsed one last time. The energy flowed into Alira's body, a surge of power that seemed to heal her, stitch her wounds together, and bring the life back into her. Alira gasped, her chest rising as her color returned, the faint glow of the crystal fading into her skin. She opened her eyes, and for a moment, the two of them just stared at each other. The battle had been won, but at what cost? Ethan collapsed beside her, his body finally giving way to the injuries he had sustained. But as Alira's hand found his, holding it tightly, he knew one thing for certain. They had both survived. Together. And that was enough for now. As the first light of dawn began to break over the battlefield, Ethan and Alira stood amidst the wreckage, their bodies battered and bruised but alive. The air still carried the smell of smoke and the echoes of destruction. The ground was scared, littered with the remains of Zenfar soldiers and drones, their once mighty weapons now silent and broken. The aftermath of the fierce battle felt almost unreal, like a nightmare that might not truly be over. Alira, still weak from the immense energy she had used to save them both, leaned against Ethan for support. Her once pristine armor was now dented and scorched, her pale skin marked with the signs of the battle she had fought so bravely. Yet in her eyes, there was a flicker of determination, a spark that refused to fade. The bond between them had grown, forged in the fires of battle, and no matter how difficult the road ahead would be, they knew they would face it together. Ethan glanced at her, his heart swelling with a mixture of awe and relief. He had never imagined that a day like this would come, that he would find himself standing side by side with a princess from another world, fighting for the survival of everything he held dear. Yet, here they were, both standing against overwhelming odds, victorious, but far from unscathed. The resistance fighters slowly gathered around them, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and admiration. They had fought bravely beside Ethan and Alira, but it was clear that without the two of them, they might not have survived. Word had already begun to spread about their heroics, about how they had stood against the Zenfar and their terrifying technology, refusing to let their world fall into the hands of the invaders. "Your heroes," one of the resistance commanders said, his voice full of reverence. "Without you, we wouldn't have made it. But we can't rest. Not yet." Ethan nodded, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage. There was a part of him that wanted to believe the battle was over, that somehow they had won. But deep down, he knew better. The Zenfar were relentless, and they would be back. They had seen what Alira could do with the crystal. They had seen her power, and they wouldn't rest until they had it in their hands. Earth was not safe. Not yet. Alira turned to Ethan, her expression calm but resolute. "We can't let our guard down," she said softly. "The Zenfar will return, and when they do, we must be ready." Ethan took her hand, squeezing it gently. He had been ready to fight before, but now, with her by his side, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The crystal had given them a powerful edge, but it was the connection they shared that would truly see them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Alira glanced around at the survivors, her eyes lingering on the faces of the resistance fighters. There was a weight to her gaze, a sorrow that reflected the price of the battle they had just fought. She had once been a princess, a figure of power in a distant empire, but that life felt so far away now. The throne she had once been destined to sit upon seemed like a distant dream, one that she had no intention of chasing anymore. "I've made my choice," she said quietly, looking up at Ethan with unwavering conviction. "The throne, the empire, none of that matters to me anymore. You risked everything for me. You saved my life, and in return, I choose to stay. I choose this life, with you. We fight for Earth, together." Ethan's heart skipped a beat at her words. He had always known that Alira was different, stronger than he ever could have imagined. But now, hearing her say this, hearing her choose him over the throne of her people, made his chest swell with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, love, respect. It was all there, tangled together. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if testing the weight of her decision. Lyra nodded, her eyes softening as she gazed at him. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The world around them seemed to fade as the two of them stood in that moment, the chaos of the battlefield forgotten. For just a brief second, they allowed themselves to feel the peace that came with knowing they were not alone. They had each other, and that was enough. But the moment passed quickly. The sounds of the resistance regrouping, preparing for the next steps, reminded them that there was still much to be done. The Zenthar might be gone for now, but they wouldn't be gone for long. They had to plan their next move, prepare for whatever came next.